everyone, it's Shell from Scrap Secrets and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be creating a birthday card using embossing, masking, and stenciling. Here's the card that we're going to create. And to start off, I took the background stamp called HB Background from MFT. I'm going to heat emboss it on this piece of cardstock, which is a 1/4 of an inch smaller than my card base. And you see the inks that I'm pointing out will show you what I'm going to be doing with them later on. First thing that I did was I took some temporary adhesive and temporarily stuck that piece of paper down to my Stamp Perfect. You'll see in a minute that I actually have to switch over to my Misty because the Stamp Perfect was a little bit too small for this 6x6 background stamp. You'll notice that I also took out the black foam piece that was in both of those because it's a red rubber stamp and it is a little bit thicker than the clear ones, so you want to make sure you take that out. I also put some temporary adhesive on the back of the 8, and I created that using my Cricut and just one of the fonts that I had on there. And now I am taking the light kaolin mask that I have that's an anti-static powder, putting it all over the background so that the embossing powder only sticks to the areas that I want it to. I'm going to place my 8 over top of that, and I could have done this first and then put the powder over top of it. It didn't stick as well, but it's okay because we're only going to need it temporarily for a mask. Now I'm using my Versamark ink pad to ink up the background and then stamp that image onto the panel. Since there are 2 layers on it, one is a mask, I did have to stamp this a couple times, and there is a little bit of a halo around the 8, but I'm okay with that. If you wanted it to be perfect up to the 8, you're going to have to press a little bit harder around the edges where the 8 is because it's harder for that ink to get there. So now I'm going to take some clear embossing powder and sprinkle it all over the words. You can see that mine are a little bit gray here. My Versamark embossing pad actually has a black tint to it because I've used it with some black inks to do a couple of different techniques. If you didn't want that gray, you are going to have to use a new one, or you could actually heat emboss it in white and it would make the words stand out as well. You could actually heat emboss it in whatever color you wanted to, but I wanted it to be clear. Obviously here you can see it's a little bit gray, so you can see the words. If it was true clear, if I had used a clean Versamark pad, you really wouldn't be able to see these words on screen, but you can see them heat emboss a little bit. Now I waited for that panel to cool down a little bit because after you heat it, it will be a little bit warm. I also was able to heat the paper up from the back a little bit to try to minimize some of the warping. I'm going to add some more of that temporary adhesive to the back of the 8 and place it back down because we're going to use it as a mask to do some ink blending over top of the background. I'm taking 2 colors of Distress Oxide, Peacock Feathers and Wilted Violet, to go over and add color to that background. I'm making this card for my niece Elizabeth, who turned 8 last month, and her favorite colors are purple and teal. Obviously, you can see from the colors that I chose. She used to love pink, and when I talked to her mom, she said she hates pink now. So I made sure not to do any pink in here. I know that the stencil just happened to be pink. It happened to be a piece of cardstock that I had lying around that I used for my stencil and my mask. Now, if I thought a little bit further ahead, I probably would have actually heat embossed that 8 and then used this in another card, because by doing this, you can create another card front with that 8 and do something different in the background. Just think that it turned out really cool. So I'm just taking the 2 colors of Distress Oxide and making sure that they blend nicely, that there's pretty much an even mixture of purple to teal on the card, and making sure that the card front looks good before we get ready to move on to the next technique. And for the next technique, you're going to want to make sure that you have the fallout pieces because we're going to use them as a stencil. So here you see the 8 that was cut around, so it's like a stencil, and then the interior pieces. I put some temporary tape on the back of all 3 of those pieces. I'm going to use some washi tape to hold them down into place. And then we're going to start creating a a stencil technique. We did the mask technique with the 8, and then now the fallout pieces, or the external and then the fallout pieces, we're going to use as a stencil. So I'm going to be using 4 colors of ink to stamp out a cluster of stars that I have from a stamp set called Lucky from Concord and Ninth. And I'm just going back and forth with all of these, turning the stars in a different way, but I'm making sure that I stamp off of the mask pieces, or the stencil pieces. I guess the middle is masked because you're masking off that, but whatever, you know what I mean. So I am making sure to get all of it, to stamp all around the areas that we have the stencil on, because that's going to help create the shape of the 8. So you can do this with any objects, and what you want to do is just make sure that you go around and the edges, that there are whatever image you're stamping with, whether it be hearts, stars, circles. I've done this with circles before when we did the hop for my friend Tara, the MS hop, and it was actually an autoimmune disease hop. I did one with a ribbon for my brother and my aunt, who both have rheumatoid arthritis. So I did this technique back then, and I loved it. It was a little bit easier because they were circles and they could fill in the spots a little bit more evenly. But with these stars, what I found I did is I just took these clusters, went back and forth, and stamped all over there. Again, making sure I stamped off of the page. And then I'm going to take single stars and fill in the rest of those spots. So using those 4 colors of ink. And sometimes I didn't clean off the ink. If I had the lighter blue and then went into the darker blue, it would actually give me a combination of those 2. So I actually got more colors than just the 4 that were on there. So I love doing that. I love mixing the inks. So there I took the, the light purple and then actually went over it with the darker purple, and I got a 3rd color. Again, just going back and forth, filling in as many of those spots as I can. There are stamp sets that I have of all different size stars. So you saw I believe I pulled 2 or 3 Concord and Ninth stamp sets to create this. And here I am going back and filling in almost every single spot that I can. You can go in and fill in the rest of them with little dots. I didn't think it looked so bad because once I took the stencil off of there, you'll see that I have that shape of the 8 down. Especially since I did the ink blending, that also helps. When you ink blend the background, it already defines the shape of that 8, so now the stars just fill it in. So if you are going to do a blended background, I would suggest doing that because it'll define where that 8 is, and you don't have to be as particular to make sure that all of the edges get stamped out. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to take off the middle pieces, and there's the 8. I love the way this came out. I thought that it was super creative. It's something different than cards that I do all the time. Now I'm just taking a cloth and buffing off the embossing, the distress ink off of the embossing powder. That's the great thing. It's called Emboss Resist, and the embossing powder will actually resist all of that ink. Just going to take some ATG and stick it down to the back of the panel, and my card is almost done. The last thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of my Spectrum Noir sparkle pen to some of those single large stars, and I believe I did some of the smaller ones too, just to add a little bit of sparkle because she's all about the sparkle and shine, especially if it's purple and teal. So I thought that added a little bit of something to the card, and this is just really a 1-layer card onto the background. So really there's no dimension. This one's really easy to pop in the mail, and I just thought it was really cute, and she loved it. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below, and I will see you again real soon for another video. Bye!